Chapter 1. The Quiet Town of Ashton Springs. Ashton Springs. Just saying the name still stirs up the scent of pine needles and warm earth, the memory of dust kicked up by tires on gravel roads, the soft murmur of the creek winding its lazy way past the edge of town. Nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural Montana, Ashton Springs was the kind of place you'd see on an old postcard. The ink faded, the edges curled from age. A quiet, unassuming town, hidden from the world as if by choice. The streets were lined with tall, ancient cottonwoods and maples, their branches reaching across the roads like old friends clasping hands. In spring, petals and pollen drifted on the breeze. In autumn, the ground turned gold and red beneath our feet. The houses stood close together, their clapboard walls and peeling paint telling stories of generations who'd called them home. No one in Ashton Springs was a stranger. By the time you were old enough to ride a bike, you knew who baked the best pies, who would scold you for tracking mud on their porch, and who would slip you a piece of candy just for saying hello. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Where life was simple, predictable, safe. For years, I believed that. I believed it with the blind certainty of a child who thought the world began and ended at the edge of town. But as I look back now, older, wiser, haunted by what came later, I realize how wrong I was. How much darkness can hide behind a neighbor's smile. I grew up on the north side of Ashton Springs, in a modest house my father built with his own two hands. Frank Daniels. A mechanic by trade, but to me, he was larger than that. Larger than life itself. He was the man people called on when their cars wouldn't start. But they also called when fences needed mending, when a roof leaked in the dead of night, or when someone just needed to sit on a porch and talk a while. My father didn't say much unless it needed saying. He believed a man's word should be solid as the steel he worked with, and that promises weren't made to be broken. His hands were strong, calloused from years of work, but when they ruffled my hair or rested on my shoulder, they were gentle. Steady. Unshakable. Or so I thought. Our garage was his domain. The air thick with the scent of motor oil and sawdust, the walls lined with tools, each in its rightful place. I spent more hours there than anywhere else, watching him work, handing him wrenches and bolts, trying to mirror the quiet focus he carried like armor. "Dad?" I asked once, maybe 8 or 9 at the time, as he wiped grease from his hands and straightened up from beneath the hood of Mr. Walker's truck. "How come you always help everybody? Even when you're tired?" He smiled then, a slow, thoughtful kind of smile that lit his eyes, but never quite erased the weariness in them. "Because, kiddo, if folks don't help each other, what's the point of living in a town like this? That's what neighbors are for." That was Frank Daniels. The man everyone could count on. The man I thought nothing could shake. But time has a way of showing you the cracks in what you thought was solid stone. There was one crack I didn't see. Not for a long while. His friendship with Henry Davis. Henry was complicated. Where my father was quiet and steady, Henry was all charm and laughter. He had a smile that seemed to put folks at ease, and a way of looking at you like whatever you were saying was the most important thing in the world. He dressed well, too. Clean shirts, polished boots, a hat tipped just so. When he passed by, people waved a little more eagerly, spoke a little more cheerfully. But I noticed, even as a boy, that behind Henry's easy grin was something harder to pin down. Attention, maybe. A watchfulness. And when Henry and my father stood together, talking in low voices on the porch at night, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight, I could feel the weight of whatever it was that bound them. I remember one night in particular. The air was cool, the sky clear and wide, scattered with stars. I should have been asleep, but I was restless. From my window, I heard the low rumble of Henry's truck coming up the drive, the crunch of tires on gravel. Then voices. My father's and Henry's, quiet at first, but urgent. I crept out of bed, careful not to let the floorboards creak, and made my way to the top of the stairs. From there, I could hear them on the porch. "It's getting worse, Frank," Henry said, his voice tight. "I saw him again. Out by the mill. I'm telling you. It's the same man. Same eyes. Same way he just disappears." There was a long pause. I imagined my father rubbing his jaw the way he did when thinking hard. "You sure it was him?" my father asked at last, low and steady. "Sure as I'm standing here," Henry replied. "We can't keep pretending this'll go away. You know it. I know it." "I know," my father said. "But we can't go stirring folks up. Not yet." Henry cursed under his breath. "You always were the patient one. But this thing. It's getting too close." Their voices faded then, as if they'd stepped farther out into the yard. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of their words. Who was he? What were they afraid of? That night planted a seed of unease in me that would only grow. Life in Ashton Springs seemed to go on as normal in the daylight. The Saturday market still bustled with chatter and the smell of fresh bread. The church bells still rang on Sundays. Kids still raced their bikes down Main Street, daring each other to let go of the handlebars. But beneath it all, I began to notice things. The way my father would glance over his shoulder more often. The way Henry seemed to visit more frequently, always after dark. The way folks in town would lower their voices when certain topics came up. The old mill, the mines, things best left alone. At school, I asked my teacher once about the mill. "Mr. Thomas," I said, raising my hand. "Why did the mill close down?" The classroom fell quiet. Mr. Thomas, a kind man with silver hair and a soft voice, hesitated longer than I'd expected. "Well now," he said slowly, "the silver dried up, son. And with it, the reason for the mill. Folks moved on, or found other work. That's all." But his eyes told a different story. One he wasn't willing to share. As I grew older, I'd come to learn the truth my father had tried so hard to shield me from. The truth he and Henry had carried between them like a burden too heavy for one man alone. There was darkness in Ashton Springs. Darkness that had been there long before I was born, and that no amount of small-town kindness could ever truly erase. And my father, my rock, had stood at the edge of that darkness every day of his life, trying to hold it back. I see him now in my mind's eye, standing in the fading light at the end of our drive, watching the horizon as if waiting for something only he could see. Waiting. Always waiting. For what, I didn't understand. Not yet. Chapter 2. Meeting Henry. Henry Davis came to Ashton Springs in the summer of 1992. I remember it was one of those hot, dry seasons where the grass turned yellow by June and the creek behind our house ran lower than I'd ever seen it. The air felt heavy, restless, like the town was waiting for a storm that refused to break. At first, no one noticed Henry. He moved into a small rental on the edge of town, a squat little house with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. Folks said he kept to himself, driving an old Kenworth truck with a cracked windshield and faded blue paint. He worked for Kenworth Transport, the local supply company that hauled everything from lumber to livestock feed across the state. That suited him. Always moving, always on the road. A man who could be part of the town and apart from it at the same time. Henry wasn't the type to stand out in a crowd. That was the strange thing about him. He didn't have the loud voice or big laugh that drew attention. He didn't tell stories or slap backs. Instead, he had this quiet, steady way about him. When he spoke, people listened. Not because he demanded it, but because his words felt like they mattered. He could sit at a table and say almost nothing at all, and still, you'd walk away feeling like you'd had a conversation worth remembering. I was just a teenager the first time I met him. 15, maybe 16, at that awkward age where you think you know everything, when the world still feels small enough to understand. The diner. It was at the diner. Miller's Diner, the kind of place that smelled of coffee and fried eggs no matter the hour. A place where the regulars always had their spot, where the jukebox still played old country tunes if you fed it a quarter. My dad went there most days for lunch, along with a handful of other men. Farmers, mechanics, drivers like Henry. I'd started tagging along during summer break, too old for a babysitter, too young for a job. I'd sip on a Coke, push fries around my plate, and listen to the low hum of adult conversation. That's where I saw him first. In the corner booth by the window, my dad across from him, the two of them leaning in like co-conspirators sharing some harmless secret. "Hey, kiddo," my dad had said that day, waving me over as I came in from the heat. "Come meet Henry." I slid into the booth beside him, eyeing the man who'd been a shadow in my periphery for weeks. He looked older than my father, late 40s, maybe even 50, though it was hard to tell. His face was weathered, lined from sun and miles, his eyes a tired blue that reminded me of the sky before a thunderstorm. "This is my boy," my dad said with pride. "Henry, meet Sam." Henry offered a hand, calloused and warm. His grip was firm, but not crushing like some men used to prove something. He smiled. A small genuine thing. And nodded. "Good to meet you, Sam. Your dad talks about you plenty." I didn't know what to say, so I just muttered, "Hi," and looked out the window, pretending to study the parking lot. They went back to their conversation. Soft voices, easy laughter. I remember my dad telling some old joke about a flat tire and a stubborn mule. Henry chuckled, a quiet sound that somehow felt real. I watched him from the corner of my eye, trying to understand what it was about this man that made my father so comfortable. A regular face. Over the months, Henry became a fixture at the diner. Every afternoon, like clockwork, his truck would rumble into the lot and he'd claim that same corner booth. He didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. He talked about the weather, the crops, the best fishing spots. My father and the others spoke of hunting trips and ball games, family stories that grew taller with each telling. And Henry. Henry listened like he cared, like every word mattered. My father admired him. I could see that. He trusted Henry in the way men trust those who have stood at their side in hard times, even though I didn't yet know what those times had been. From all I could see, they were good friends. The kind of friends who didn't need to say everything out loud. And me. I grew used to Henry's presence, the steady rhythm of his visits, the way his voice blended into the background of my summers. He became part of the landscape of my life. Familiar, almost invisible. The fishing trip. It was late August when my father suggested a fishing trip. Just the three of us. I remember the air was thick with the smell of pine sap, and the lake was so still it looked like glass. We set out before dawn, the truck packed with rods, tackle, and a battered cooler filled with sandwiches and soda. Henry drove, my father riding shotgun, me in the backseat watching the sun climb over the hills. Henry didn't say much on the way out. Just pointed now and then at landmarks I didn't know. A dead tree shaped like a claw. A rock outcropping that looked, from a certain angle, like a face. My father filled the silence with stories, his voice easy and warm. When we reached the lake, we unloaded and cast our lines. The water mirrored the sky, and for a while, the only sounds were the soft splash of bait hitting water and the distant cry of a hawk. It was peaceful. I remember thinking that, how peaceful it all felt. Henry sat beside me on the bank, watching the ripples spread out from his line. After a while, he glanced over and said, "You're a good kid, Sam. Your dad's proud of you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, feeling my cheeks warm. There was something about the way he said it. Not like small talk, but like he meant it. That was the thing about Henry. He could make a simple statement feel important. The secret beneath. For years, I didn't see anything strange about Henry Davis. I saw a man who worked hard, kept to himself, and treated my father like a brother. A man who always seemed calm, who had a steady hand and a kind word. But there were moments, small ones at first, that hinted at something beneath the surface. Like the night I came downstairs for a glass of water and found Henry and my father standing out on the porch, their voices low, their faces serious in the moonlight. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt the weight of them, heavy as the summer heat. Or the way Henry sometimes stared out at the woods beyond our house, as if looking for something. Or someone. His eyes would go distant, his jaw tight, and then he'd blink, smile, and it would be gone. And always, that same corner booth at the diner, that same easy laugh, that same quiet charm. A man you could trust with your life. Or so I thought. The unraveling. Looking back, I see now how blind I was. How carefully Henry had built the mask he wore, how easily we all believed it. There was a darkness in Henry Davis, a shadow that followed him into town and settled quietly behind his tired eyes. A secret so deep that it twisted everything I thought I knew. About him, about my father, about the town itself. But at 15, all I saw was a friend of my father's. A man who took me fishing, who bought me a soda at the diner, who tipped his hat to Mrs. Miller when she brought his coffee. The truth. That would come later. And when it did, it would change everything. Chapter 3. The Dark Truth Unveiled. I always thought I knew Ashton Springs. Every cracked sidewalk, every leaning fence, every face that greeted me on Main Street. When I left for college, I carried that small-town certainty with me, like a well-worn photograph tucked into my pocket. A reminder of home, of simplicity, of safety. The city changed me. It was louder, faster, messier. The nights hummed with sirens and neon lights, the days blurred together with noise and motion. I learned to move with the crowd, to keep my head down, to stop expecting that strangers would smile as they passed. It was a different world. And so when I came home for that visit, just a long weekend between semesters, I craved the quiet of Ashton Springs. The familiar creak of our porch swing. The smell of my father's coffee brewing at dawn. The way the town seemed frozen in time, as if nothing bad could ever touch it. At first, everything felt exactly as I remembered. The hills rolled gently into the horizon, the diner windows gleamed in the morning sun, and the old cottonwoods along Main Street swayed in a lazy breeze. The faces were the same too. Older, maybe, but still warm, still familiar. But then, on that Saturday afternoon, the illusion cracked. The diner lot. I'd borrowed Dad's truck to run into town for a few things. When I pulled into the diner lot, I spotted him right away. My father, leaning against the tailgate of Tom Keller's pickup, his arms folded, his head bowed in thought. Tom stood opposite him, his face drawn tight, his voice low but urgent. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I swear I wasn't. But as I stepped out of the truck, the wind carried Tom's words straight to me. And those words stopped me cold. I can't believe it, Frank, Tom said, shaking his head. Henry Davis. The Green River Killer. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. The sound of it, the Green River Killer, rang in my ears, louder than it should have. Familiar, terrible. I froze, one foot still on the running board, my breath caught halfway. My father didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the ground, his jaw clenched, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his cap. When he did finally speak, his voice was hoarse, as if it hurt to push the words out. I thought you knew, Tom went on, quieter now. We all did. We tried to tell you, Frank. But you were too close to the man. Too loyal. the weight of the words. I stepped down, the gravel crunching under my boots, but neither of them noticed me. My heart pounded so hard I thought surely they'd hear it. I wanted to say something, to ask what they meant, but my voice failed me. Henry Davis. The man who'd sat at our table. The man who taught me how to tie a better fishing knot. The man who'd ruffled my hair on my 15th birthday and handed me a pocket knife. Every man ought to have one, he'd said. That man. That man. The Green River Killer. The monster from the headlines. The predator who haunted the Northwest, who took women's lives and left families shattered. I'd heard his name in the city, read it in the papers. I'd imagined him as a faceless evil, a stranger in the night. And now that evil had a face I knew. The conversation continues. My father rubbed a hand down his face, like he could wipe away the truth Tom had laid bare. I never saw it, Tom, he said finally, his voice thick with grief. God help me, I never saw it. Tom sighed, softer now. None of us wanted to believe it, but it all started coming out. The evidence, the witnesses, his runs up north, the time he spent in Seattle, the dates Frank. They lined up. They always lined up. My father shook his head, his shoulders slumping like the weight was too much. I thought I knew him, he whispered. I thought he was my friend. Memories in a new light. I backed away before they could see me, my mind spinning, my chest tight. I walked down the alley behind the diner, past the smell of frying grease and old garbage, past the battered dumpsters and the broken fence. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to think. I thought back to the nights Henry came by after dark, his boots dusty from the road, his eyes tired but kind. To the way my father welcomed him without question. To the long talks on the porch, the fishing trips, the quiet companionship. I remembered the way Henry watched the woods sometimes, his gaze far away. The nights I'd seen him standing alone at the edge of the yard, staring out into the dark. And now, every one of those memories felt poisoned. Had we all been blind? Had I? The aftermath. That night, I sat on the porch long after my father had gone to bed. The stars stretched out above me, cold and distant. The wind rustled through the trees, and I thought of all the times Henry had sat here too, sipping coffee or beer, his boots propped on the railing. How could a man carry that kind of darkness and never let it show? How could he sit with us, laugh with us, break bread with us, and then go out and do the things they said he'd done? And my father, how could he not have known? Or had he known, deep down, and just refused to see it? When I finally came inside, I found my father at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. I heard you and Tom, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't look up at first. When he did, his eyes were red-rimmed, full of sorrow I'd never seen before. I'm sorry you had to hear it that way, he said. I wanted to tell you myself. I didn't know how. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of Henry's betrayal settling over us like a heavy blanket. The unspoken questions. I had so many questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. How long had the others suspected? What signs had we missed? Could we have stopped him? Could he have stopped him? And worst of all, what part of my childhood had been built on a lie? But in that moment, I understood that my father was asking himself the same questions, turning them over and over in his mind like stones in a river. And there were no answers that would ever make it right. The final realization. In the weeks that followed, the truth about Henry Davis spread through town like wildfire. People whispered his name in shocked tones, trying to reconcile the friendly truck driver they'd known with the monster from the headlines. Some refused to believe it even then. Some swore they'd always known. And all of us, in our own way, mourned the loss of the man we thought he was. As for me, I learned something I'd never forget. That evil doesn't always come in the form we expect. Sometimes it wears a friendly face. Sometimes it sits at your table and calls you by name. And sometimes it fools even the best of men. My father never spoke Henry's name again. Not once. But I saw the shadow it left on him, in the quiet moments, in the way he watched the horizon like he was waiting for something he couldn't quite name. And I watched too. Because once you've seen that darkness, you can never look at the world the same way again. Chapter 4. The Confessions and the Shadows. The truth about Henry Davis did not come like a thunderclap or a single terrible revelation. It unfolded slowly, in pieces, like a puzzle where each new piece made the image more horrifying. It came in whispers, in headlines, in sleepless nights where I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of how a man I'd known, a man I'd trusted, could have hidden that kind of darkness for so long. It began with his arrest. A quiet headline in the back of the Billings Gazette. Local driver held in connection to serial murders. No name at first, just the bare facts. A truck driver, picked up by authorities in Washington state, linked through DNA evidence to unsolved cases stretching back decades. But the next morning, the name was there. Henry Davis. Our Henry. The man from the diner booth. The man who'd handed me a pocket knife on my birthday. The town reacts. Ashton Springs didn't take the news well. At first, people refused to believe it. I remember standing in line at the general store, listening to old Mr. Jensen mutter to himself as he read the paper. No. No, that can't be right. Not Henry. Not our Henry. Others reacted with anger. Betrayal. How could they have been so fooled? How could they have let a monster sit among them, sip coffee with them, share jokes and fishing stories? The diner, once a place of easy laughter and friendly chatter, turned somber. The corner booth where Henry used to sit remained empty, as if no one dared claim it. It became a kind of shrine to their guilt. I'd walk past and see folks glance at it, then quickly look away, like the memory of him was too much to bear. My father's silence. At home, my father said little in those early days. He kept the newspaper folded on the table but didn't open it. When I tried to talk about it, he'd shake his head, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. The man who always had something steadying to say now seemed hollowed out. One night, I found him in the garage, sitting on the old stool near his workbench, the light from a single bulb casting harsh shadows. "Dad," I said quietly. He didn't look at me at first. He was staring at his hands. Hands that had fixed engines, built fences, mended broken toys. Hands that had shaken Henry's. "I should have seen it," he said finally, his voice raw. "God help me, I should have seen it." "There was no way to know," I offered, but the words felt useless. He gave a bitter laugh. "Wasn't there? All those nights he showed up late. The way he'd clam up about his runs up north. The times he'd stare off like he wasn't really here. I thought he was just tired. Lonely maybe. Never crossed my mind. Never." The articles. The local papers were relentless. Each day brought new details, each worse than the last. Driver linked to Green River killings confesses to more victims. Officials. Death toll could exceed 80. Trail of terror spanned 2 decades. I read every word, unable to look away even as my stomach churned. The pattern became chillingly clear. Henry had used his job as cover, traveling lonely highways, stopping at truck stops, gas stations, and diners in small towns much like ours. He'd pick up women who were down on their luck. Drifters, runaways, women desperate for a ride or a meal. He'd offer a smile, a kind word, a promise of help. And then he'd take everything from them. The confession. When the news broke that Henry had confessed, the town seemed to hold its breath. People gathered at the diner, not to eat, but to talk in hushed tones, to try and make sense of the man they thought they knew. "I sat across from him every day," I overheard one of Dad's friends say, his voice shaking. "God help me, I shook his hand every damn day." "Don't beat yourself up, Tom," another said. "We all did. He fooled us all." But no one said it with conviction. The guilt settled on everyone like dust. Thick, clinging, impossible to wipe clean. The weight of memory. For me, the hardest part was remembering the small kindnesses. The way Henry had taught me to skip stones at the lake. The time he'd helped Dad patch a fence after a storm. The afternoon he'd fixed my bike chain when it popped off on Main Street. All those moments felt like lies now, like tricks played by a master manipulator. I'd lie awake at night, replaying those memories, searching for signs I'd missed. A glance that lasted too long. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. Anything. But there was nothing. He'd hidden it too well. My father speaks. One evening, long after sunset, my father finally spoke of it. Really spoke of it. We were sitting on the porch, the night air cool and still. He lit a cigarette, something I hadn't seen him do in years. "You know what haunts me most?" he said after a long silence. I shook my head. That maybe he wanted to be caught. Maybe all those nights he sat with us, all those quiet conversations. Maybe he was waiting for one of us to see through him. And none of us did. I didn't know what to say to that. The idea chilled me. That Henry might have been daring us to see the monster beneath the mask, and we'd all looked away. The shadow over Ashton Springs. Weeks turned into months, but the shadow Henry left behind didn't fade. The diner never felt the same. The corner booth stayed empty, no matter how busy it got. People still gathered there, but the laughter was quieter, the conversations more guarded. Every time I passed the old house where Henry had lived, I felt the weight of it. The knowledge that behind those walls, he'd planned his roots, hidden his secrets, perhaps even dreamed of his next victim. And my father. He carried the guilt like a stone in his chest. I'd catch him sometimes staring down the road, as if expecting Henry's truck to come rumbling up the drive one last time. A community forever changed. The town tried to move on. But how do you move on from something like that? How do you look your neighbors in the eye, knowing how easily evil had slipped into your midst? Some folks left. Others stayed but changed. Quieter, warier, less quick to trust. And I carried the story of Henry Davis with me, a reminder that even in the safest places, shadows can hide in plain sight. Henry's actions became part of Ashton Springs' history, whether we wanted them to or not. His name was never spoken aloud anymore, but it lingered. In the empty booth at the diner, in the way people locked their doors at night, in the silence that followed any mention of truck drivers or missing persons. And for me, it lingered in every memory I couldn't quite bring myself to throw away. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. The day Henry Davis was convicted, Ashton Springs changed forever. And so did my father. The trial had been a spectacle, though not in our town. It took place up in Washington, where most of Henry's terrible deeds had unfolded. But the news reached us like a storm, sweeping through the streets, rattling windows, seeping under doors. We followed the trial in the newspapers and on the radio. Sometimes, the television at Miller's diner would hum with the latest reports. Henry's face, once so familiar, now hardened, hollow, unrecognizable as the man we thought we knew. When the verdict came, guilty on count after count, no one in Ashton Springs cheered. There was no relief, no closure. Only a deep, abiding sorrow. And for my father, there was something worse. Shame. The town turns cold. In the weeks that followed, the town turned inward. Neighbors who'd once waved as they passed on the street now kept their eyes averted. The men at the diner, who used to greet my father with hearty handshakes and easy laughter, fell silent when he entered. Some still tried. Tom Keller, old Pete from the hardware store. But even their words felt forced, strained. It wasn't that they blamed him outright. Not really. But the questions hung unspoken in the air, heavy as thunderclouds. How could Frank not have known? How could a man be so close to a monster and see nothing? Couldn't he have stopped it? They never said it to his face. But you could see it in their eyes. A life in retreat. My father felt their stares, their judgment. And so, little by little, he withdrew. He stopped going to church. The pew where we'd always sat, third row from the back, near the window that let in the morning sun, remained empty. The pastor came by once or twice, offering words of comfort, but Dad thanked him politely and sent him on his way. The diner, too, became a place he avoided. I'd see him hesitate when we drove past, his gaze lingering on that corner booth that no one claimed anymore. Once, I suggested we stop in. Just for coffee, just like old times. But he shook his head. No point, he said quietly. Not anymore. The house grew quieter. He no longer invited friends over for barbecues or poker nights. The radio played softly in the background most days, tuned to stations that didn't cover the news. The world outside seemed to shrink until it was just him, me, and the ghosts of what had been. Evenings on the porch. On some evenings, he'd sit on the porch, the same place where he and Henry used to share a beer or talk into the night. He'd sit there, silent, watching the horizon as if searching for something out in the dark. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of gold and rose, I brought him a glass of iced tea and sat beside him. Dad, I said, my voice tentative. You couldn't have known. No one could have. He didn't look at me right away. When he did, his eyes were tired, older than I'd ever seen them. That's just it, Sam, he said softly. I should have. I let him in. I called him my friend. I trusted him. And all the while. His voice trailed off, lost in the weight of what he couldn't finish saying. I didn't have an answer. I just sat there, the cicadas humming in the trees, the last light of day fading around us. The guilt that clung. The guilt gnawed him. I saw it in the way he moved. Slower now, as if carrying an invisible burden. I saw it in the sleepless nights when his light stayed on long past midnight. I saw it in the quiet sighs, the faraway looks, the unfinished sentences. He stopped keeping up the house the way he once had. The fence needed mending. The paint peeled on the porch railings. The garden, once his pride, grew wild, the weeds overtaking the rows of tomatoes and peppers. I did what I could to help, but I was young, struggling to make sense of it all myself. And some hurts, I learned, can't be fixed with a hammer or a coat of paint. The unseen scars. The townspeople moved on in their way. New gossip replaced old. The diner found its rhythm again, though that corner booth stayed empty, as if no one dared disturb the memory of Henry's ghost. But my father never moved on. He lived with the betrayal like a scar that wouldn't heal. It wasn't just that Henry had fooled him. It was that he had believed in Henry. Trusted him. Called him brother. And that trust, shattered, left him hollow. I remember one night. A stormy night in late autumn. The wind howled through the trees, rain lashed against the windows. I found my father standing in the garage, staring at the old fishing rods he and Henry had used. Without a word, he gathered them up and carried them outside. I watched from the porch as he tossed them onto the wood pile. The rain soaked him through, but he stood there, striking a match again and again until finally the flame caught. The rods, the tackle box, the memories. All of it burned. He came back in, dripping, silent, his face set. And after that, he never spoke Henry's name again. The slow decline. The years wore on, and the weight of it all took its toll. My father's health began to fail. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. Just a slow wearing down. His heart grew weak. His steps grew unsteady. The light in his eyes dimmed. Doctors talked of age, of stress, of things that couldn't be undone. But I knew. I saw it clearly. It wasn't just his body that was tired, it was his spirit. He passed quietly on a winter morning, with frost on the windows and the first light of dawn creeping over the hills. I held his hand in those final moments, and I hope he knew, truly knew, that I never blamed him. That no one with a good heart could have seen what Henry had hidden so well. The shadow that lingers. After the funeral, I stayed on in Ashton Springs for a while. I tended the house, put the garden to rights, fixed a fence he'd let fall into disrepair. But everywhere I looked, I saw the shadow of what had been. The porch swing where they used to sit. The dusty garage where those fishing rods had once hung. The empty chair at the head of the table. The town softened with time. Folks offered kind words, spoke of my father's generosity, his decency, his kindness. But I knew, and they knew, that he'd lived his final years under a cloud he hadn't deserved. And Henry Davis. His name faded from our lips, but not from our thoughts. The weight of his betrayal remained, a lesson carved deep into the heart of our town. That evil can wear a friendly face, and sometimes, the people we trust most can hide the darkest secrets. Looking ahead. I left Ashton Springs eventually, though it never truly left me. Wherever I went, I carried my father's memory, his quiet strength, and the hard truth that shaped our lives. I visit his grave now and then, when I can. I sit by the stone, run my fingers over the name etched there, and I tell him about my life. About the good things. About how I've tried to honor him. Not for what he missed, but for what he taught me. That we must be kind, even in a world where shadows can fall across the brightest places. And as I stand, brushing the leaves from his grave, I remember his words that night on the porch. I trusted him. And I think, yes, Dad. Because you were good. Because you believed the best in people. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. Not ever. Chapter 6. The Legacy of Silence. I left Ashton Springs in the fall, when the leaves were turning, and the mornings carried a bite of cold. The town looked the same as it always had. The tree-lined streets, the battered old diner, the cottonwoods along the river. But I knew I couldn't stay. The memories clung too tight, too sharp. And no matter where I turned, I saw the shadow Henry Davis had left behind. I packed up my father's old truck, the one we'd worked on together so many afternoons in the garage, and I drove away before dawn. The sun rose behind me, casting long gold fingers across the fields. I didn't look back. Starting over. I settled in a city far from Montana. A place where no one knew my name, where the story of Henry Davis hadn't poisoned the air. I found work, made friends, tried to build a life that wasn't haunted by what I'd left behind. But no matter how far I went, the memories followed. There were nights I'd wake in a cold sweat, my heart racing, as if I'd heard Henry's voice in a dream. I'd see his face. That familiar, weathered face. And then remember the truth beneath it. The truth that had torn a hole through my father's heart and through mine. I'd walk crowded city streets, watching strangers pass, and wonder. How many of them wore masks like Henry's? How many hid darkness behind a kind smile, a quiet laugh? The weight of what we didn't see. The hardest part wasn't the horror of Henry's crimes. As unbearable as that was. The hardest part was the betrayal. The knowledge that we'd let him in. That we'd called him friend. I thought often of my father's words on that porch the night he burned the fishing rods. I trusted him. God help me, I trusted him. And I thought of the questions that still haunted me. Had Henry ever thought of us as anything but cover for his crimes? Had he ever felt guilt? Or had we just been useful fools, a small town backdrop for the life he wanted to hide? Returning home. Years passed. I built my life, brick by brick, but the foundation always felt a little cracked. And eventually, I found myself drawn back to Ashton Springs. It wasn't planned. I was driving cross-country, a business trip, and when I saw the sign, Ashton Springs, 12 miles, I felt something pull at me. I turned off the highway, my hands gripping the wheel tight, my stomach knotted with dread and longing in equal measure. The town hadn't changed much. A few new storefronts, a coat of fresh paint on the gas station, but the bones of it were the same. The diner still stood, though the sign was faded and the windows didn't shine like they used to. I parked out front and sat for a long while, watching. The door swung open now and then, letting out snippets of conversation, the clink of cutlery, the smell of coffee. But I couldn't bring myself to go in. That corner booth was still empty. No one sat there. No one ever would. Talking to Tom. I found Tom Keller at the hardware store. He was older, grayer, but the same steady presence he'd always been. His eyes widened when he saw me, and for a moment, I thought he might look away, like so many had done in those awful months after Henry's conviction. But he didn't. He came around the counter and pulled me into a rough embrace. "Sam," he said. "I'll be damned. It's good to see you." We talked for a while, there among the shelves of nails and paint cans, and it felt almost normal. Almost. "You staying long?" he asked. I shook my head. "Just passing through. I wasn't sure why I came." He nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. The conversation that needed saying. Before I left, I asked him the question that had burned in me all those years. "Tom, do you think we should have seen it? Do you think we could have stopped him?" He didn't answer right away. He rubbed at his jaw, staring at a spot on the floor. "Sam," he said finally, "if we'd known, really known, we'd have done something. Your father most of all. But Henry was. He was a master at hiding what he was. Don't carry that weight. Your dad wouldn't want that for you." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I could let it go. The legacy that remains. I drove out of Ashton Springs that evening, the sky painted with the colors of sunset. The town faded in my rearview mirror, but the memories stayed. Henry Davis's legacy wasn't just the lives he'd taken. It wasn't just the horror he left behind in the woods and truck stops and lonely highways. His legacy was also the silence that followed. The silence in our town, in my father's heart. In mine. It was the questions that would never be answered. The trust that could never be fully rebuilt. The corner booth that would forever sit empty. And as much as I tried to outrun it, to build a life beyond it, I knew the truth would always be with me. We'd welcomed a monster into our midst. We'd shared meals with him, laughed with him, called him friend. And we hadn't seen the danger until it was too late. What I carry. Even now, years later, I find myself watching people differently. I look for signs. I wonder about the secrets they keep. I know it's no way to live. Always wary, always bracing for the worst. But it's the price of what we live through. And yet, I also carry something else. A memory of my father's goodness. His kindness. The way he opened his heart to people, even when it left him vulnerable. Henry Davis's betrayal didn't change who my father was. It didn't erase the decency he showed every day of his life. And that, I've come to see, is the true legacy I should hold on to. The final thought. Ashton Springs will never forget Henry Davis. His name is etched into our history, a dark chapter that no one can erase. But what I choose to remember is my father's unwavering belief in the good in people, even when it hurt him. Especially when it hurt him. Because in the end, that's what made him the man I'll always be proud to call my father. And that's the legacy I will carry forward. In silence, yes, but with strength.